My name is Linda, but everyone calls me Liddy, and I'm 54 years old. Until that night, I thought I had raised a decent daughter, respectful, honest, not perfect, but someone who would never deliberately humiliate me. I was wrong, completely wrong. It was a Sunday evening in early October, the kind of night where summer clings to your bones, but the wind outside already bites. The restaurant glimmered like a jewel perched over the marina. Chandeliers hung low, spilling light across tables dressed in crisp white linens, the silverware polished to a reflective shine. Candles trembled in crystal holders, flickering shadows across faces and menus. The scent of rosemary, seared salmon, and citrus soap in the restroom blended oddly, like elegance tainted with antiseptic sterility. I slid into the seat my daughter had saved for me, my hands brushing the envelope I had brought for her father, Ethan, a small token of love, a card meant to be thoughtful, respectful. I smiled, trying to start a conversation, but she barely glanced at me. Then she spoke. Her words sliced through the warmth and glow of the room. Honestly, Liddy, you're such a loser compared to Daddy's new wife. She actually knows how to live. Time stopped, my mouth went dry. The white linen under my hands suddenly felt like sandpaper. The red wine I'd just poured trembled in its glass. I wanted to vanish. My daughter, my child, had just destroyed me in front of everyone. And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about her, about us, crumbled. Before we continue, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. If stories like this one resonate with you, hit subscribe. Mornings always began the same way for me, a cup of black coffee brewed strong enough to wake the senses before the city outside even yawned. I liked to sit by the kitchen window, watching the lights stretch over the rooftops, listening to the faint hum of traffic that promised the world was moving even if I felt stuck. My little apartment smelled of toasted bread and Earl Grey, and my cat, Jasper, would wind around my legs like a living scarf, demanding his share of attention before I could even sip the first bitter drop. After breakfast, I checked the mail, a ritual I never missed. Bills, catalogs, letters with elegant handwriting. I kept everything in neat stacks on the counter. Each envelope held its own story. Birthday cards from old friends, thank you notes from neighbors, occasional letters from Rachel during her university years. I still remembered the excitement when she was 13, tucking a tiny folded note into my palm, promising me secrets I would guard. Those little slips of paper had felt like proof that she trusted me. Now, they felt heavy with absence. My days were mostly quiet, spent tending my small consulting practice. I wasn't ambitious, but I prided myself on reliability. Clients knew they could count on me, and that steadiness had its own satisfaction. Yet, even in the routine, subtle reminders of family dynamics lingered. My ex-husband James, now remarried, still called occasionally, more out of habit than necessity. Christy, his new wife, was everywhere without being invited, at school events, neighborhood functions, even the occasional charity gala. She had a way of slipping into spaces, smiling at everyone, as if the world belonged to her. Rachel, my daughter, was the axis of these routines. She was 27, working in marketing, navigating a life that seemed both independent and tethered to us. In the mornings, she called just to check if I'd eaten or asked what I was doing that day. It was polite, perfunctory, sometimes warm. Occasionally, though, I noticed her glances at Christy's Instagram, at the effortless life she posted, weekend getaways, designer coffees, sparkling selfies with James. My heart tightened, but I brushed it off. I had nothing to compete with, not really. I reminded myself that I had given Rachel stability, values, and love. Afternoons were a mix of errands and quiet reflection. Grocery stores were the predictable backdrop to my life, the familiar scent of fresh bread, the rhythm of carts gliding across polished floors, the nods to other shoppers who recognized me from the farmer's market or Sunday church. Even here, symbols of family lingered. The fridge at home was a shrine of sorts, photos of Rachel as a child, her first piano recital, the homemade birthday cakes I baked with more patience than talent. There were little mementos, keys from our old house, a silver locket I had given her for her 16th birthday, letters tucked into drawers I sometimes opened absent-mindedly. They reminded me of continuity, of love carefully cultivated over decades. Weekends were devoted to connection. I attended church regularly, volunteered when I could, and sometimes hosted a small brunch for friends who had become family. These gatherings were gentle, affirming rituals. I liked to see Rachel at the table, laughing at stories from my past, teasing James in harmless ways, or rolling her eyes at Christie's anecdotes. I noticed then, even subtly, the differences in how she treated each of us, the respect, the warmth, or the deference she reserved. It never seemed extreme, but the small glances and quiet side remarks occasionally prickled my awareness. There were also the more delicate routines of observation. I kept a mental ledger, noting the way James would comment on Christie's achievements, or how Rachel would light up at compliments from strangers while barely acknowledging mine. I told myself it was natural, that family relationships were complicated, layered with history. Still, the unease was there, quiet and persistent. The subtle favoritism, the slight dismissals, tiny inconsistencies that could be explained away but never entirely ignored. Home itself was a repository of memory and symbolism. The small living room was lined with bookshelves, photos in uneven frames, and little tokens from past trips. I kept a desk cluttered with letters and mementos, each with a story, each carrying a weight that sometimes pressed on me in the evenings. On the wall above the couch hung a photograph of Rachel at 10, holding a medal from a school sports day, her grin wide and unself-conscious. I had looked at that photo hundreds of times, each glance a reminder that she had once been the daughter who looked up at me with unquestioning admiration. And yet, there were signs I had ignored. Rachel's tone when talking about Christie sometimes carried an edge, a subtle admiration mixed with critique. She would praise Christie's choices, laugh at James's stories, and occasionally give me a perfunctory smile when I entered the room. Small disagreements emerged, framed as casual opinions, like preferring one restaurant over another or dismissing a gift I had spent hours choosing. I brushed these off, reminding myself that she was growing up, forming her identity separate from mine. I wanted her to flourish. The envelope I carried to the dinner that would change everything had been part of this web of routine. Inside, a card for Ethan. A simple gesture, acknowledging his birthday with quiet respect. I had written it in my careful, neat handwriting, remembering the afternoons we spent together as a family long before Christie arrived. The card was a symbol of what I thought mattered: thoughtfulness, love, continuity. I had never imagined that such a small, deliberate act could be ignored, dismissed, or weaponized in the way it would be that evening. Evenings often ended with quiet reflection, a cup of tea, the soft hum of a radio in the background. I would reread letters from Rachel, smooth out the creases in the envelope, admire small tokens like the silver locket or keys from our old home. These objects were anchors, reminders that the world was not always as fleeting or harsh as it could feel in moments of doubt. Still, subtle unease had begun to seep in. The way Rachel sometimes lingered at Christie's stories, the way James's new life seemed to overshadow mine, the whispered comments from neighbors praising Christie's charm over my steadiness, all of it formed a quiet tension in my daily life. It was like the prelude to a storm, barely audible, easy to ignore, but undeniably present. I went to bed that night with the same routine I had followed for years. Lights dimmed, the envelope tucked into my bedside drawer, photos on the wall catching the last flicker of lamplight. Jasper curled against my feet, soft and warm. And yet, a faint worry nagged at me, an unease I couldn't quite shake. It was the kind of feeling that whispers before it roars, a warning I would come to understand far too well. The moment came before the first course even arrived. Rachel leaned back in her chair, crossed one leg over the other, and tilted her head in that familiar way, half thoughtful, half impatient. She had a fork in her hand, but wasn't touching the plate in front of her. Instead, her gaze found James across the table, and then Christie, sparkling in her red dress. "Honestly, Liddy," she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to pierce the quiet hum of the restaurant, "you're such a loser compared to Daddy's new wife. She actually knows how to live. I mean, look at her. She travels, she goes out, she does things. You just exist." The words didn't land at once. At first, I thought I had misheard. My chest tightened, my stomach knotted. Did she really just say that? My hand, which had been resting lightly on the envelope for Ethan, twitched. The card I had written with care, my neat handwriting, My carefully chosen words of respect and affection felt suddenly worthless, a paper shield torn to shreds. I forced a smile, trying to disguise the jolt of humiliation, but my teeth clenched. The candle flickered in its crystal holder, throwing small shadows across her face, as if even the light recoiled at her words. My eyes darted around the table. James froze mid-laugh at some old anecdote I couldn't even hear over the rush of blood in my ears. Christie's grin widened, perfectly composed, as though my daughter's cruelty had been rehearsed for her benefit. Even the waiter, pausing to refill a glass of water, cast a fleeting glance that felt like judgment. For a moment, disbelief took hold. I remembered when Rachel was 10, sitting cross-legged on the living room carpet, showing me the birthday card she had made for me, insisting that every color, every letter, every sticker was chosen just for me. That child had hugged me tight, whispered secrets, and promised loyalty. Where had that girl gone? What had happened to the person who once said, "I love you, Mom, no matter what"? "Rachel," I began, my voice trembling in ways I hadn't anticipated. "I don't." She cut me off with a laugh, soft but cruel. "Oh, come on, Mom. Don't look so offended. It's just the truth." I felt the heat rise in my chest, a mix of hurt and burgeoning anger. The air seemed to tighten around me, the amber glow of the chandelier suddenly too bright, too accusing. I wanted to pick up the card, show her, tell her that a birthday note could carry more thought than her entire lecture about how I didn't measure up, but the words stuck in my throat. I glanced down at the envelope, so small and fragile, and realized it had already become invisible to her. My gesture of care, my attempt at maintaining respect, had been dismissed in an instant. My mind raced. Had I been naive all these years? Had the trust, the bond I had thought unbreakable, been an illusion? The waiter returned, placing the first plates in front of us, but I couldn't focus. The seared salmon on the pristine white plate, the delicate rosemary sprigs, the carefully folded napkin, all of it blurred into insignificance. My world had narrowed to the girl who was supposed to be my daughter and the words that had struck me like a physical blow. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, but I refused them. Not here. Not in front of all of them. I straightened in my chair, trying to reclaim the dignity that had been stripped away. Each second stretched, filled with the silent judgment of other diners who might have overheard, the faint clink of silverware, the whisper of a napkin against the tablecloth. My heart hammered, the anger mingling with the ache of betrayal. For the first time, I understood that the child I had raised with care, patience, and love could deliberately wound me in public. And as Rachel sipped her water, smiling faintly, I felt a chill I had never known before, a realization that nothing would ever feel the same again. The fragile comfort of our relationship, carefully preserved over decades, had been shattered with a few words over red wine and white linen. That night, I went home carrying more than the envelope in my bag. I carried humiliation, disbelief, and the first ember of anger that would not be extinguished. A line had been crossed. A truth had been revealed, and in that moment, I knew everything had changed. The morning after that dinner, I woke before the alarm, heart still hammering from the memory of Rachel's words. Jasper, ever faithful, curled at my feet, but even his purrs couldn't soothe the unease coiling in my chest. I went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat at the table with the envelope still resting beside my notebook. I stared at it, feeling the weight of its ignored contents, and wondered where the line had been crossed. Not just at dinner, but years before. I started with my phone. Messages from Rachel, innocuous enough at first, good mornings, check-ins, reminders about bills. But as I scrolled back, I noticed the subtle shifts, shorter replies, delayed responses, faint echoes of admiration for Christy threaded through casual conversation. Daddy's wife said this, Christy always knows, nothing overt, nothing cruel, yet the pattern was unmistakable. My stomach clenched with worry. Had I misread all these years? Was I imagining this? I went to the drawer where I kept old letters and cards. A note from Rachel when she was 17 slipped from between two folders, a tiny scribble about how Mom always tries too hard. I had long since forgotten it. My hand shook as I unfolded it, reading the words again. The voice I had trusted, the voice I had loved, felt alien. How could this have started so subtly, and I remained blind? Determined to find answers, I dug deeper. There were bills, legal documents, and old bank statements tucked into a folder labeled Family. My ex-husband's name appeared more than once, associated with trips and dinners I hadn't been aware of. My heart raced. Did Christy influence these decisions? Were my daughter's opinions being guided, even manipulated? I didn't want to believe it, yet the evidence hinted at something beyond simple teenage rebellion or adult independence. I began watching Rachel in real life, not just in messages. At brunch with mutual friends, I noticed the way she laughed at Christy's jokes, her smile wider and more eager. She complimented Christy's dress, her career moves, even her taste in wine, while I received polite nods or a brief acknowledgement. Nothing aggressive, nothing that could be openly called disrespect, yet the contrast was stark, impossible to ignore. Every glance, every subtle inflection, every tilt of her head seemed choreographed to remind me of my place. Mutual friends, too, offered whispers that stung. "She really looks up to Christy," one said with a cautious smile. Another muttered, "Rachel always admired how effortless she is." I asked questions carefully, framing them as curiosity, but the answers cut like knives. Admiration, they said. Appreciation. Inspiration. But none of it addressed the underlying betrayal, the deliberate dismissal of me, her mother, the woman who had raised her with love, patience, and respect. I started keeping a small journal, recording each interaction, each observation. Every text, every glance, every whispered remark became part of a pattern that I was determined to map. I wanted clarity. I wanted understanding. I wanted to know whether this was a phase, a manipulation, or something more permanent. One afternoon, while reorganizing a drawer in the living room, I found a small photo tucked behind an old stack of birthday cards. It was a candid shot of Rachel and Christy at last year's neighborhood charity event. They were laughing, shoulders touching, heads close, completely absorbed in each other. In the corner, James's hand rested lightly on Christy's back. I felt a pang of betrayal unlike anything I had anticipated. The image seemed to mock me, a frozen tableau of intimacy from which I was excluded. The envelope I had brought for Ethan lingered in my mind. Its quiet presence, the effort it represented, the thoughtfulness. It had been invisible to Rachel at dinner. I pulled it from the drawer, turning it over in my hands, running my fingers over the neatly printed words. A small crease, unnoticed, seemed suddenly symbolic. My care overlooked, my presence disregarded, my love dismissed. I began to dig through old papers, letters, and diaries, seeking patterns, clues, anything that would explain the widening gulf between us. I discovered receipts from dinners Rachel had attended with Christy and James, never mentioning me, never including me. Notes about events I had forgotten, entries in a shared calendar I hadn't realized existed, all hinted at an exclusion I could no longer deny. I questioned myself constantly. Was I imagining things? Was my sense of betrayal a projection, an overreaction rooted in fear of losing her? Yet, every thread I pulled revealed more, small omissions, subtle shifts, and deliberate exclusions. The picture became clearer with each discovery. The girl who had once confided in me, the daughter who had written me those tiny notes about secret plans, seemed to be replaced by someone who measured me against Christy at every turn. Keys to the old house, once meaningless, became symbols. They were in a small box, one set for Rachel, one for James, and one for Christy. Their positioning on the shelf had always been arbitrary, but now they seemed like markers of access and control. Who belonged where, who had influence, who was excluded. The envelopes, the letters, the keys, they were all pieces of a puzzle I was only beginning to understand. By the end of that week, the curiosity had transformed into something sharper, determination. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I called a close friend who knew the family history, someone impartial. "Do you think Rachel could be influenced?" I asked, careful not to sound accusatory. My friend hesitated, then said quietly, "It's possible, Liddy. She looks up to Christy in ways that maybe you don't realize." That remark sent a chill down my spine. It confirmed what I had feared but didn't yet fully grasp. Influence, admiration, manipulation. It was all part of a web that I hadn't been able to see until the moment Rachel spoke at dinner. The investigation had begun in earnest, the threads of suspicion growing tighter with every observation, every document, every whispered comment. By Friday, I had reconstructed a partial timeline of interactions, dinners Rachel hadn't mentioned to me, trips taken with Christy, subtle hints in social media posts, casual remarks that now seemed pointed. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. I realized I could no longer ignore what had been happening in plain sight for years. I closed the folder, my hand steady now, a cold clarity replacing the initial shock. The curiosity, the worry, the creeping doubt, they had fused into determination. I would uncover the truth. I would know exactly what had shifted between us, and I would confront it. Not out of spite, not out of anger alone, but to reclaim the dignity that had been eroded step by step, message by message, glance by glance. And deep down, I knew one thing. Once the investigation began, nothing would ever be the same. It was late one rainy Tuesday when the first real clue surfaced. I had returned home from a long day at work, the streets slick with rain reflecting the city lights like a fractured mirror. Jasper padded silently beside me as I hung my coat, the soft hiss of droplets against the windows punctuating my thoughts. I had been sifting through papers all day, scanning old receipts, letters, and event invites, when a folded envelope slipped from the back of a drawer. It wasn't new. I recognized the handwriting. It was Rachel's, but unfamiliar. The neat block letters were deliberately small, almost clipped, and the paper had been hidden beneath the stack of bills I had barely glanced at. Curiosity pricked at me, and I carefully unfolded it. The note was brief, almost clinical. Don't bother inviting me to family events unless Christy is there. I feel more comfortable with her guidance. Daddy agrees. I dropped the paper, my coffee mug rattled against the countertop. My heart felt as though it had been punched in the chest. Guidance. Agreed. My own daughter had not only dismissed me, but had actively sought the approval and influence of my ex-husband's new wife. The envelope I had brought for Ethan, the card tucked carefully inside, suddenly felt heavier, almost laughably naive. All my care, my thoughtfulness, my attempts at maintaining respect, invisible. I sank into the chair, clutching the folded note. Images from that night at the restaurant flashed through my mind. The flickering candle, the red wine I barely touched, Rachel's precise words, Christy's composed smile. It all made sense in a way I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. The cruelty hadn't been impulsive. It had been guided, rehearsed, subtly reinforced behind closed doors. I pulled out an old photograph from the drawer, a picture of Rachel and me at her college graduation. She was beaming, holding her diploma, and I was proud beyond measure. I traced the edges with my finger, remembering the quiet handshake she insisted upon instead of the hug I expected. Even then, I had shrugged it off as teenage independence. But now, with the note in my hand, I saw the first hints of a pattern, subtle dismissal, careful management of interactions, and alignment with Christy that had been quietly developing for years. The realization hit me with a double edge, shock and betrayal. My daughter had been manipulated, perhaps willingly, into seeing Christy as a model, while my place as her mother was minimized. It wasn't just disrespect, it was deliberate redirection of loyalty, like a stream diverted from its natural course. I remembered the envelope again, still tucked away. I picked it up, running my fingers over the smooth cardstock, the neat handwriting. That small gesture of love and respect now felt like a relic from another world, one in which my influence still mattered. The contrast between my thoughtfulness and Rachel's strategic allegiance was unbearable. Determined to understand more, I began scanning through the documents I had collected in my ongoing investigation. There it was, a series of emails between James and Christy, subtle arrangements of dinners, trips, and gifts, all involving Rachel but rarely including me. My head spun as I realized the threads were connected, each seemingly innocent outing, each casual note, each shared joke between Rachel and Christy had been reinforcing this divide. I felt the rush of betrayal sharpen into something more potent, a thirst for justice, a demand for recognition. I wanted Rachel to understand the weight of her actions, to feel, even briefly, the humiliation and hurt she had caused. Yet, I didn't know the full extent. This first reveal was only the tip of the iceberg. There were layers still hidden, motives still unspoken, the complete picture obscured by years of subtle influence and careful manipulation. I placed the envelope on the counter beside the wine glasses, the same ones from the night at the restaurant, the ones that had trembled in my hand as Rachel spoke. Their reflection in the dim light seemed to echo that moment, as though the room itself remembered my humiliation. I realized I would need to confront the situation carefully, to gather evidence, to follow each thread to its origin. But I could feel the shift in myself. Curiosity and worry had evolved into resolve. This first revelation made everything painfully clear. Rachel's admiration for Christy wasn't incidental. It had been nurtured, encouraged, and leveraged. And while I didn't yet understand all the mechanisms, I knew one thing without a doubt. I could no longer accept being sidelined, dismissed, or ridiculed. The betrayal stung, yes, but it also ignited something far stronger. A demand for truth, a need for clarity, and a determination to reclaim my dignity. The puzzle was only partially revealed, but I was already piecing together the next steps. And deep down, a cold certainty settled in. Once I uncovered the rest of this web, no one, neither Rachel nor Christy, would be able to manipulate me or diminish my place again. It was 2 weeks after the first reveal when I finally confronted Rachel. I had rehearsed my words in the quiet of my apartment, pacing past the photos of her as a child, past the keys to the old house, past the envelope for Ethan that still sat on the counter like a silent witness. I knew this conversation wouldn't be easy, but my patience had frayed to the point of snapping. I called her, inviting her to meet at a small cafe she liked. Neutral ground. No white linens, no chandeliers, just coffee and the promise of honesty. When she arrived, her smile was effortless, polished. Her hair caught the light as she tucked a stray strand behind her ear. I gritted my teeth. She had no idea how much I already knew. "Liddy," she began, casual, "what's this about?" I held up the folded note I had found, the one tucked behind Bill's, still crisp. "Do you remember this?" I asked, voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Her eyes flicked briefly to the paper. She laughed, light, dismissive. "Oh, that?" I was joking. "Joking?" I repeated, tone sharper. "You told me not to invite you to family events unless Christy was there. You wrote that, and you expected me to believe it's a joke?" Her laugh faded slightly, replaced by a faint curl of annoyance. "Liddy, you always overreact. I was just trying to explain how I feel. How you feel." My voice rose, though I bit back tears. "You humiliated me at dinner. You praised Christy over me. Do you have any idea what that feels like?" She tilted her head, adopting that casual posture I had seen so many times, the one that made her look untouchable. "Mom, you're taking this too seriously." It wasn't a big deal. Everyone's lives are different now. Christy and Dad, they just connect better with me. "Connect better?" I echoed, disbelief tightening my chest. "Is that what you call dismissing your mother in public, laughing at her while she's trying to share a moment with you?" Her eyes narrowed, a subtle defense mechanism. "You're imagining it. Really, Mom. You're seeing things that aren't there." Gaslighting. The word had never felt more real. My own daughter, denying my experience, twisting it into something I couldn't trust. My hands clenched around the note. The paper crumpled slightly. Symbols of love and trust, ignored, dismissed, weaponized against me. I remembered the silver locket I had given her on her 16th birthday, a small, delicate piece I had hoped would remind her of our bond. I pulled it from my pocket, holding it between us. "Do you even remember this? Or have all the memories of us been overwritten by admiration for someone else?" She hesitated, but only for a heartbeat. Then she said softly, almost smugly, "Mom, that's not fair. Christy is my stepmother. Of course I listen to her. She knows things about Dad. I don't. That doesn't mean I don't care about you." "You listen to her instead of me," I snapped, the quiet cafe suddenly feeling too small, too tight around my chest. "You laugh at her jokes. You seek her advice. You elevate her over me. That's not care, Rachel. That's replacement. That's betrayal." Her face twisted, a mixture of defensiveness and irritation. "Liddy, you're overreacting. I think differently now." Adults change, families change. I leaned across the table, gripping the locket tighter, and whispered, "You've been guided, manipulated, trained to see me as less." "And you didn't even think to question it?" She recoiled slightly, brushing at her hair, a subtle admission of guilt or fear. "Mom, stop. You're twisting this. I'm not doing anything to hurt you." "But you are," I said, voice rising despite the other patrons. "Every glance, every word, every subtle dismissal, don't you see what you're doing?" The cafe felt suffocating. I noticed a woman at the next table glance over, sipping her latte, eyes wide. I didn't care. My dignity, my sense of self, had been challenged repeatedly, publicly, privately, for weeks. And now, I refused to remain silent. After a pause, Rachel muttered, "You always make it about you. You always think the world revolves around your feelings." Her words were the final straw. I let go of the locket, letting it rest on the table, a quiet symbol of all the memory she had chosen to dismiss. My anger, sharp and righteous, coiled inside me like a spring. Enough. I would not be undermined, ignored, or humiliated any longer. I remembered the keys from our old home, still displayed on the shelf behind me as if mocking the bonds we once shared. Access, control, trust. They were all fractured now. Holiday dinners, family traditions, even birthdays had become arenas of subtle contest, each event an opportunity for Christy and Rachel to signal that my presence and my efforts were no longer central. I could feel the resolve settling like a stone in my chest. This wasn't just frustration anymore. It was a determination to reclaim my dignity, to confront the manipulation, and to set clear boundaries. I would no longer allow myself to be sidelined in my own family, dismissed as irrelevant or less than. After she left the cafe, smiling faintly as if nothing had happened, I sat back, gripping the locket and the crumpled note. The anger remained, but now it had direction. I would gather the evidence, follow the trail, and make sure that Rachel and anyone complicit understood the consequences of their choices. Public humiliation, private manipulation, gaslighting. It had been leveled against me repeatedly. I refused to endure it any longer. My voice, my presence, my worth were non-negotiable. I went home that evening, sat at the kitchen table with the envelope for Ethan still waiting, and made a vow to myself. Enough was enough. No more silent pain. No more watching my dignity eroded step by step. I would act. And when I did, everything would be accounted for. I decided to confront James and Christy at the family gathering for Rachel's birthday, a subtle but deliberate choice. Neutral ground, I told myself. But as I arrived, the air already felt thick with pretense. The living room was lit with warm amber tones, laughter echoing lightly over glasses of wine, the scent of roast chicken mingling with vanilla from the candles. Rachel floated between the adults with that same poised elegance, her eyes scanning, calculating. Christy stood nearby, chatting, sparkling, every movement rehearsed. And James, smug, grinning as though he had orchestrated a perfect little play, unaware, or perhaps fully aware of the damage his silent complicity had caused. I carried the envelope for Ethan in my bag, the folded note from Rachel tucked inside, and the silver locket around my neck. Each item was more than a symbol. It was proof, evidence, a story of care, betrayal, and manipulation. I had rehearsed every word in my mind, but when the moment came, the tension tightened my throat like a vice. I waited until we were all seated at the dining table, the same one where Rachel had humiliated me weeks ago at the restaurant. The white linen, the polished silverware, the flickering candle. They all felt loaded with memory now, with history and pretense. I set the envelope down carefully in front of Rachel. "This," I said, voice low but steady, "is what I brought for Ethan weeks ago. I wrote it with thought, care, love." And yet, at dinner, it was ignored. My efforts, my attention dismissed in front of everyone. Do you know what that feels like? Rachel's face flickered, that calm mask briefly cracking. Christy's smile faltered for a second, just enough to show awareness. James shifted uncomfortably, the first real sign of guilt since this had begun. I pulled the folded note from my bag and laid it on the table, smoothing the crease with my fingers. "And this," I continued, "was hidden in my own home, tucked behind bills. A note from you, Rachel, saying not to include me in family events unless Christy is present. I want you to tell me, was this a joke? Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. Mom, Was it? I interrupted, leaning forward. My fingers hovered over the silver locket I had given her years ago, a tangible reminder of trust and connection. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like careful planning, a deliberate alignment, a manipulation. And don't look at me like I'm overreacting. I have proof. I turned to Christy. And you. How long have you been guiding her? How long have you let her see me as less than, invisible, irrelevant? Christy's eyes widened slightly. Liddy, this is unfair. You never what? I demanded. Encouraged this? Whispered in her ear. Taught her to dismiss me, humiliate me publicly, because the evidence says otherwise. James shifted, his hands tight around his wine glass. It's not like that. Isn't like that, I echoed. Rachel called me a loser. In public. Praised you over me. And you did nothing to correct her, nothing to remind her of respect or decency. Rachel spoke then, voice quivering slightly but still practiced. Mom, I feel more comfortable with Christy. She understands Dad. She helps guide me. You don't what? I asked, cutting her off. Guide you? Love you? Offer support? You've been doing exactly what she told you to do. Measure me against her, elevate her over me. And this is the truth. It hurts. It's betrayal. I reached for the keys displayed in the hall, ones that once symbolized home and belonging. These keys, our home, our family, our trust, they weren't just for show. They were proof of access, of connection. You've used access, privileges, and guidance to isolate me. That is manipulation. That is disrespect. That is betrayal. The room was silent, except for the soft crackle of the candle in the center of the table. Its flicker reflected in Rachel's eyes, mirroring the emotional turbulence she had caused. She looked at me, truly looked, perhaps for the first time in years. Mom, I didn't. You did, I said softly but firmly. Every glance, every word, every action calculated to make me feel less. And it ends now. Not because I want to hurt you, Rachel, but because I refuse to allow myself to be diminished anymore. Christy's composure finally cracked. She opened her mouth, closed it, then finally said, Liddy, that's enough. You're making a scene. A scene, I echoed, standing tall. You mean telling the truth is a scene? Public humiliation, private manipulation, calling your mother a loser and elevating someone else over her, is that not a scene? James finally spoke, his voice low. Liddy, maybe I'm not imagining this, James, I interrupted, holding up the note and the envelope. I have proof. And now, we're going to address it honestly. Christy, you have influenced my daughter. Rachel, you have allowed it, and I will no longer accept either of you undermining me, publicly or privately. Rachel's face went pale, her usual grace faltering. Mom, you didn't mean, I said, voice rising like a bell, echoing the years of overlooked effort, ignored cards, whispered manipulations. Intent doesn't erase impact. And the impact has been humiliation, betrayal, and pain. But I am done being the silent victim. I am done being invisible in my own family. I placed the silver locket on the table, letting it catch the candlelight. These symbols, keys, photos, letters, were meant to remind you both of what matters: love, respect, dignity. You ignored them, but now I am reclaiming them. I am reclaiming myself. For the first time, Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I saw recognition there, and perhaps remorse, though fragile. Christy's carefully constructed smile had vanished. James slumped slightly, finally confronting the weight of his passive complicity. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension release slightly. Shock had given way to vindication. I had exposed the manipulation. I had forced acknowledgement. I had regained control over my dignity. From this point on, I said, voice calm but unyielding. I set the terms. Respect me, or I step back. Humiliate me, or you face consequences. This family, our bonds, our memories, they are not tools for favoritism or manipulation. They are sacred, and I will not let them be cheapened." The room was silent for a long moment. The candle flickered again, as if marking the shift in energy. I could feel my own empowerment, the steady pulse of self-respect that had been buried under years of subtle betrayal. Rachel finally whispered, almost inaudibly, "I understand." I nodded, knowing that full understanding might take time, but also knowing that the first step had been taken. The pieces, the envelope, the note, the locket, the keys, had all played their part in this reckoning. And in that quiet, amber-lit room, I realized something I hadn't felt in years. I was no longer the silent, invisible mother. I was a woman, reclaimed, dignified, and unwilling to accept being diminished. Shock had given way to vindication to empowerment. For the first time since that fateful dinner, I felt the weight of humiliation lift, replaced by clarity and strength. I had spoken, I had confronted, and I had reclaimed myself. The days after the confrontation were quieter than I expected, though not entirely peaceful. Rachel avoided me at first, retreating to her room, her calls sparse and hesitant. Christy, ever the social chameleon, seemed flustered in public gatherings, her laughter forced, her usual ease replaced with an awkward awareness. And James, well, James finally looked uncomfortable in ways I hadn't seen in years. The smugness that had shielded him from responsibility faded, replaced by a simmering realization that he had allowed our family to fracture under his passivity. The first real shift came at breakfast the following Sunday. Rachel slid into the chair across from me, her shoulders tense, her eyes lowered. She didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't pretend. She simply said, "Mom, I've been thinking about what you said." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "And?" I didn't realize how much I'd been influenced," she admitted quietly. "I thought I was making my own choices, but I was just repeating what I'd been guided to think. And I hurt you." Her words hit me, soft but piercing. The anger and humiliation that had consumed me for weeks began to ebb, replaced by a cautious relief. She was acknowledging the truth, finally taking responsibility for her actions. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't complete forgiveness. But it was the first step toward balance, toward recalibration. James eventually joined us in the living room, attempting to offer excuses, but I held up a hand. "James, this isn't about blame. It's about accountability. You allowed the dynamics to shift, and the consequences were clear. I don't need apologies. I need recognition and respect going forward. If you can manage that, we can move forward." He swallowed, nodded stiffly, and for the first time, I felt him truly seeing me. Not the past Liddy, the accommodating wife, or the silent mother, but me, a woman who had demanded dignity and received it. Christy, observing from the side, said nothing. I didn't need her input anymore. The balance had been restored without drama or theatrics. Over the next weeks, the household rhythms began to change subtly. Rachel no longer sought Christy's approval first. She made space for conversations with me, genuine discussions that weren't preempted by comparison. She asked questions, listened, and even shared small victories in her life without measuring them against someone else. It was different, hesitant perhaps, but real. I found myself sitting quietly one afternoon, tracing my fingers over the envelope I had brought for Ethan months ago. I smiled softly. That simple card, once dismissed, had been a tangible reminder of the care and thought I had poured into this family. Symbols mattered, letters, keys, photos. They weren't just objects. They were pieces of our history, reminders of what had been and what could be restored. I began to reclaim other traditions, subtle ones I hadn't realized I had surrendered. Sunday dinners were mine to host again, without the tension that had hovered when Christy's presence dominated. Family gatherings had an air of calm respect rather than silent competition. The silver locket, which had felt heavy with betrayal, now rested lightly around my neck, a reminder that bonds could be tested, strained, and still endure if treated with care and honesty. Even James adjusted. He no longer sought to mediate or influence. Instead, he acknowledged his role and quietly stepped back when necessary. Christy, meanwhile, seemed to realize that her position had limits. She smiled politely, offered occasional advice, but no longer attempted to control or overshadow the natural flow of mother-daughter dynamics. Balance had been restored. The relief I felt was profound. The humiliation that had pierced me over dinner, the whispered judgments, the subtle exclusions, all of it had been confronted and accounted for. I had demanded recognition, and I had received it. My dignity was intact, my voice heard. The family had recalibrated, not perfectly, but with honesty and boundaries that ensured respect would remain central. Even Rachel, after a quiet talk one evening, asked if we could go through old photo albums together. She wanted to see our shared memories, unfiltered by outside influence. I agreed. As we flipped through the pages, pointing out vacations, birthdays, and small tender moments, I felt a sense of calm settle in. The warmth of connection returned, slow but steady. The past hadn't been erased, and neither had the pain, but recognition and effort had begun to rebuild trust. I realized then that justice in its purest form wasn't about punishment. It was about acknowledgement, boundaries, and restored balance. I didn't need Christy to falter or James to grovel. I needed my dignity back, and I had claimed it. I needed Rachel to understand the weight of her choices, and slowly she was learning. Even small gestures felt like victories, a smile shared without calculation, a genuine question asked without expectation, the simple act of being seen and heard. These moments reminded me why I had fought so hard, not for control, not for vindication, but for the quiet, enduring truths that had always mattered: respect, honesty, and love. By the end of that month, I could sit at our dining table without fear, without hesitation, without recalling the sting of public humiliation. The white linen, the flickering candle, the wine glasses, all remnants of past pain, now felt neutral, almost comforting. I had faced the storm, asserted my truth, and emerged with my pride intact. In those moments of restored calm, I understood something deeply important: dignity isn't given, it's claimed. And once claimed, it radiates quietly, reshaping relationships and restoring equilibrium. My family, my home, and my heart all reflected that balance. I was no longer the mother silenced by subtle manipulations. I was a woman who had been seen, who had spoken, and who had been heard. The relief was gentle but profound, the calm solid, and my pride fully restored. Sitting here now, weeks after the confrontation and the quiet recalibration of our family, I find myself reflecting on everything that happened. The humiliation at dinner, the whispered manipulations, the subtle ways my dignity was chipped away. It all feels like a distant storm now, one I weathered and survived. But surviving isn't the same as understanding, and the real lesson came afterward in the calm and the clarity. I've learned that dignity is not given, it must be claimed. Again and again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it risks conflict. It's the quiet refusal to allow others to diminish you, the courage to name injustice, and the strength to set boundaries without guilt. I realize that love, real love, cannot exist without respect. And respect cannot be assumed, it must be maintained. I also learned that influence can be subtle, insidious, and easily mistaken for loyalty or affection. My daughter, my Rachel, didn't act alone. She was guided, encouraged, reinforced by patterns and words that I hadn't noticed until it was almost too late. Recognizing manipulation, naming it, and addressing it directly allowed me to reclaim my voice. And that voice matters. The silver locket, the envelope for Ethan, the keys to the old house, all symbols I once thought trivial, reminded me that history and memory carry weight. They are tangible anchors in a world where relationships shift and loyalties can be tested. Holding on to them, honoring them, and letting them inform my actions gave me the strength to act with integrity rather than anger. Now, I speak to you because I know there are others who have felt this same sting, who have been sidelined, dismissed, or humiliated in the people closest to them. I want you to hear this. Reclaim your voice. Name the truth. Set boundaries. You are allowed to protect your dignity, to demand respect, and to refuse being treated as less than. And yet, even in confrontation, there is room for grace. Rachel is learning slowly. Change takes time, but the first step is recognition. That's the balance between strength and empathy, holding firm without crushing, speaking clearly without destroying. So I ask you, whoever you are, sitting there with your own quiet hurt or your own family tension, what would you have done in my place? Would you have stayed silent, swallowed the humiliation, or would you have spoken as I did, with dignity intact, demanding honesty and respect? I share my story not to boast, but to offer perspective, to offer hope. Even when betrayal stings, even when manipulation hides behind smiles, it is possible to reclaim your place in your own life. Stand firm, speak your truth, protect your dignity, and remember, it's never too late to restore balance, to reconnect, and to move forward with both strength and grace.